Outrage is big business. Over the past decade, an entire ecosystem of grifters has flourished on YouTube and across social media, profiting from the amplification of anger and fear.
I love nothing more than to be dragged out at every fucking conceivable opportunity so you can fucking current day us!
It doesn't take much to spark their ire nowadays. A character with transgender surgery scars in a video game, the casting of a black woman in a major franchise, or even according to one list of supposedly woke games, simply a woman holding a sword. Really, if there's a single thing that deviates from their idea of cultural purity, it will provoke some form of backlash.
They're pursuing a strategy trying to appease the woke brigade, who will come hunting for them if they deviate from the woke worldview.
These figures, from YouTube pundits like Critical Drinker to political provocateurs like Matt Walsh, have all weaponized the smallest moments of media representation into framing them as existential threats. And their message is always the same. The representation of marginalized identities is an attack on tradition, identity, and the very fabric of society.
And there's more to wokeness, of course. It also destroys family bonds. It breeds resentment, not just between races, but even worse, between families, between generations. It unmoors you. It removes all connection to your past, to your family, to your ancestors, to your culture, particularly if you're white. And the ultimate goal is to take away meaning for your life. A woke life is a life without meaning.
But what sets these grifters apart isn't just their outrage, but their use of storytelling to sell it. They frame themselves and their audiences as embattled heroes in a larger-than-life narrative, fighting against a world that's leaving them behind. Borrowing the language of epic myths, they cast diversity as villainy, portraying every step towards inclusion as a dangerous departure from the natural order.
That's why they would like to erase our modern mythology and destroy our traditional heroes to make it look like nothing has changed.
But this grift is more than just a cynical cash grab selling to their audience what they already wanted to hear. It's them selling a vision of political uniformity, one where resistance to systemic inequality is framed as dangerous chaos and where societal problems are reduced to the action of individual bad actors. By centering their rhetoric on nostalgia for a lost past, one that was never as idealistic as they claim, these grifters align themselves with a vision of authoritarian control, where order is restored by suppressing dissent and marginalizing the other. While all of these tropes align with the rise of fascism, they also shape how we as a culture understand stories, and by extension, how we understand ourselves. These narratives that we tell teach us what is possible, what is worth striving for, and what we should fear. When the dominant storytelling mode centers conquest and individualism, it limits our ability to imagine futures grounded in care, collaboration, or systemic transformation. So if we want to challenge systems of oppression, whether political or cultural, we must also challenge the very frameworks we use to tell stories. Because while stories are not the change themselves, they influence how we think about it. Only then, if we understand the core root of the problem, can we begin to imagine narratives that value humanity, vulnerability, and the possibility of building something new. But before we get too far into this video, I want to share something really exciting. I am going to be assistant directing and producing a short film made by Susan and Tilly Bridges, a team of married writers, one of whom is trans, who worked on shows like Star Trek Prodigy and were writers on Monster High. The short film is called Long Away, and I think it's going to be a really beautiful story that centers upon a transgender character and is something I think we really need right now. However, we have just launched a Seed and Spark crowdfunding campaign in order to get support for the movie. So if you are curious and want to support sci-fi made by cool transgender creators, please go check out the link below. It's going to be an amazing project, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. It's one of 3 really cool projects that I am getting to work on this year outside of YouTube, and the first that I am actually going to be able to talk about. So please consider giving, because this film will not be able to happen without your help, and you'll be able to get yourself perks to it. I think it's going to be something really special and cool, and you can learn more down at the link below. And I should also say the other secret project that I mentioned at the end of this video is something completely different, because I filmed it before I knew we were going to be announcing the Kickstarter at this time. Just FYI. Anyways, back to the video. Joseph Campbell's monomyth, or what would become the basis of the hero's journey in scriptwriting circles, is everywhere as one of the pervading storytelling methods of the past few decades, and has become increasingly mainstream. It's the backbone of Star Wars, the templates of countless Marvel movies, and the story that young men are subtly, or not so subtly, taught to see themselves in. The monomyth, as discussed in Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, reduces all myths to a single archetype. A lone hero ventures out, faces trials, and returns transformed with an elixir to save their community. It draws heavily on Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Campbell argued that the archetypes like the hero, mentor, and shadow are universal, embedded deep in our shared psyche. And this idea suggests that these roles are not just cultural constructs, but inherent truths, framing the hero's journey as an inevitable, almost divine structure for how stories, and by extension societies, should function. That we need heroes because it's what the collective will wants and needs. That heroes rise to represent our will.
The achievement of the hero is one that he is ready for, and it's really a manifestation of his character. And it's amusing the way in which the landscape and the conditions of the environment match the readiness of the hero. The adventure that he's ready for is the one that he gets.
And this idea is seductive. After all, who wouldn't want to be a chosen one, wielding a lightsaber or an infinity gauntlet to save the day? However, Campbell's proposal for universality is far from politically neutral. The monomyth aligns neatly with Western culture's values of conquest, mastery, and individualism over collaboration, humility, and interconnectedness. Campbell's totalizing narrative erases non-Western mythologies that emphasize communal transformation and mutual support, folding every story into Campbell's frameworks, while sidelining those that might challenge its individualistic hierarchical values. Thus, it teaches young men to see themselves as lone agents of change, measuring their worth by external triumphs rather than relational growth or unlearning harmful beliefs. Campbell's use of Jung's concept of the collective unconscious presents these archetypes as inevitable truths rather than cultural constructs, legitimizing the idea of history being shaped by great men, that these great men are inevitable human nature. This worldview enshrines a vision of history that aligns closely with white supremacy by having their lone, often white, often male, saviors triumphing over racialized or othered forces. Consider how Luke Skywalker's journey in Star Wars positions him as the singular inheritor of the Force, sidelining Leia, whose potential as a Jedi is largely ignored for those films. Or how superhero films often portray systemic injustice as solvable only by the virtuous actions of strong individuals, actions almost exclusively performed by white protagonists. The monomyth's nostalgic decay lies in its reliance on past stories to define the future, collapsing the forward motion of time into a recursive loop. By drawing from mythic archetypes and insisting that the lessons of ancient tales hold the answers to contemporary challenges, the monomyth resists innovation. It presumes that the structures of the past are inherently suited to guide the present and the future, and in doing so, it denies the possibility of creating something entirely new.
You know, we've been collecting stories as people for, we don't know how long, really. We don't know, 100,000 years maybe. We have ancient written stories, like the Enuma Elish, which is a Sumerian story, the oldest written story we have, 4,000 years old, based on a oral tradition that's probably 20,000 years older than that. We've been collecting stories for a long, long time. What do they mean? What are they good for? Collect 1,000 of the most interesting stories. And then imagine that you were some kind of literary genius like Shakespeare, and you could take those 1,000 interesting stories and boil them down to 100 really interesting stories. And then imagine that you had 10,000 years to gather up those 100 most interesting stories and average them, and you could come out with one perfect story, the best story, the most interesting story that you could possibly tell. Well, that's what a myth is. It's the most interesting story you can possibly tell.
Instead of a future that is expansive and liberatory, the monomyth offers only a repetition of the past, cloaked in the illusion of progress. Luke recreating the Republic, for example, rather than creating something new after the Empire. And in this structure, when the villain is part of the system, it's always individual bad actors corrupting the purity of the system. At the end, the system remains and the bad actor is removed, thus setting everything back to right.
Is this S.H.I.E.L.D.? This is what S.H.I.E.L.D.'s supposed to be.
And the monomyth serves as a narrative mechanism for maintaining this hierarchy, presenting history as a series of individual exceptional achievements rather than collective struggles. And by doing so, erases the labor, resilience, and solidarity of marginalized communities, reinforcing a worldview where whiteness and individualism are naturalized as the forces that move history forward, leaving collective unity and the systemic transformation out of the frame entirely. This reliance on the past mirrors a distinctly Western binary worldview that underpins much of its narrative framework, the eternal tension between oppressor and oppressed. This binary reduces complex human relationships to a simplistic power struggle, one where one side must dominate the other to win. Man over woman, black versus white, civilized culture versus the primitives. In this schema, the oppressed are not trusted to rise without falling into the same patterns of their oppressors, as if anger and trauma inevitably lead to abuse of power. Such a narrative turns the pursuit of justice into a ticking time bomb. Even when these narratives gesture at systemic issues, such as, for example, the racism confronted in Falcon and the Winter Soldier,
I feel it. The stares, the judgment. And there's nothing I can do to change it. Yet I'm still here. No super serum, no blonde hair or blue eyes.
they often villainize radical movements led by oppressed groups, framing their resistance as dangerous and over the top.
I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
They're doing it the wrong way, when you can work within the system to do it the right way. Yell at a senator to do better.
You control the banks. Shit, you can move borders.
You can knock down a forest with the email. You can feed 1 million people with a phone call.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
This reinforces the idea that those fighting back against systemic violence or those perpetuating violence within the system are the true threat, while the systems themselves remain untouchable.
I don't think it would help you to change the system, but it would help you to live in the system as a human being.
This fear saturates Western storytelling, shaping oppressed characters into cautionary tales. Villains are often framed as oppressed figures who go too far, their causes undermined by their excess. The underlying message is clear. Challenging the status quo is inherently destabilizing, and those who seek change must navigate a narrow moral path to avoid becoming monstrous themselves. It implies that justice, when pursued with too much fervor, self-destructs into vengeance. Ultimately, the monomyth's nostalgic decay serves to reinforce the status quo. By presenting oppression as cyclical and unavoidable, it legitimizes existing power structures as the least dangerous option. It reduces the future to a reflection of the past, a perpetual return to the same archetypical struggles, foreclosing the possibility of imagining a world where power is not wielded hierarchically, but collaboratively. This decay transforms what might once have been a tool of transformation into a cage of inevitability, where the future is never allowed to escape the shadow of its past. And these tropes do more than just entertain, they mold cultural assumptions, subtly teaching audiences that domination is the only language that humanity understands. They discredit alternative versions of power rooted in community healing and mutual accountability, suggesting that all revolutions are destined to betray their ideals eventually. In doing so, the monomyth perpetuates not just the myth of the great man, but the inevitability of conflict as the defining force of human history, foreclosing the possibility of transformation through solidarity or care. Ridley Scott's Gladiator 2, by the way, offers a recent example of this style of storytelling and the assumptions of the monomyth and how it perpetuates problematic narratives about power, heroism, and resistance. The story of the movie follows Lucius Vernus, the white grandson of a former Roman emperor who is living under an assumed name in what is now modern-day Algeria, portrayed as fighting and living equally among a diverse group of people. However, he is captured when Rome conquers the city and is brought back as a slave, setting the stage for his transformations into a symbolic leader. It's important also to recognize that this film is a mysticized version of Rome. This is not actual Roman history. There's a lot of divergences and liberties that it takes to shove all of history into this style of storytelling. Taking up the mantle of Maximus from the first film in the series, Lucius inspires a revolt among the slaves, many of whom are black, framing him as a white savior whose singular vision of a better Rome drives the collective resistance.
You can join me and fight for a freedom far beyond these walls.
There once was a time when honor meant something in Rome. In this Rome, I no longer believe that exists. We must find it.
Meanwhile, the GOAT himself, Denzel Washington's character, Mercurius, Lucius' slave owner, uses Lucius' gladiatorial wins to gain favor from the corrupt, queer-coded twin emperors and manipulate himself into power. These emperors, portrayed as decadent and villainous, are the film's only queer-coded characters, reinforcing harmful stereotypes that equate queerness with moral corruption. And this is especially troubling given the actual historical context in Roman society, because there, same-sex relationships among the upper class were actually seen as expressions of dominance rather than deviance, as long as the one in the higher power position was, you know, doing the penetrating. If they were the ones doing the fucking, then it wasn't seen as gay. Is basically what I'm saying. Anyways, Mercurius eventually reveals himself to have been a former slave who kills the two emperors, and reveals that he wants to dominate Roman society.
The best revenge is to become unlike the one who did the injury. I have made myself unlike your father. He spoke of dreams, I speak of truth. And the only truth in my Rome is the law of the strongest.
He is revealed to be a strength overall fascist type who believes in the dominance of the powerful over the powerless and becomes the foil to Lucius, who represents those of the oppressed. He is the hero who comes with the elixir to save us all.
Will nothing kill this barbarian? Name is Lucius Verus Aurelius. Man did not become emperor by bloodline alone. It must be taken by force and kept by force. Are you such a man as this? I don't fight for power. I fight to free Rome from men like you and to return it to them. The gods themselves want Rome reborn. They sent me to fulfill that task.
Ultimately, Lucius kills Mercurius, dismantling his oppressive vision and ushering in his own dream of Rome, which the film frames as noble and redemptive, ready to build a new world built on caring for all and equality because Lucius has come and saved the day. The hero who has brought back the elixir, and even though he refused the call at the beginning, has taught us how to better ourselves.
My grandfather Marcus Aurelius talked of the dream that would be Rome. A dream that my father, Maximus Decimus Meridius, died for. An ideal. A city for the many and a refuge for those in need. A home worth fighting for. A home that Maximus spent his life defending.
He is the collective unconscious that we all wanted to make a better Rome, putting down the bad apples in the system and that one villainous oppressed guy who went a little bit too far with his vengeance. And thus a new Rome is born. The film itself, by the way, is steeped in nostalgia for the first film as well, obsessively recycling the myth of heroic greatness from the past. Where Maximus was the hero before him, we have just another figure in the endless cycle of Western storytelling, the archetypical savior. And this nostalgic framing not only celebrates the heroes of the past, but traps the narratives in an endless repetition of the same story, one that is not as good as the one that came before. But it's still the exceptional individual rising above systemic oppression to save the collective. And by doing so, the film mirrors the decay of Western storytelling, endlessly regurgitating old myths without meaningfully interrogating or evolving them. Even the film's historical revisionism reinforces this decay. It pretends that Lucius's dream of Rome can fix its inherent flaws, ignoring the reality that Rome's systemic corruption was in full swing at the time that Lucius took power, and Rome's collapse occurred not long after, and by doing so, the film erases the true reasons for Rome's downfall, the oppressive systems it upheld, the inequalities it sustained, and the exploitation that fueled its empire. Instead, it grafts this sanitized narrative onto a storyline that can be sold to modern audiences, framing Rome as an aspirational model just as modern-day America faces its own decline for eerie similar reasons. Rather than confronting the lessons of Rome's collapse or interrogating the systems of oppression that persist today that mirror it, the film clings to the myth of the exceptional hero, offering a comforting fantasy of renewal while sidestepping the realities of history and power. And what's frustrating to me is when I left the film after seeing it in theaters, I heard one of the two guys that I was sitting next to talking about how they liked this movie better than the first one, but they couldn't really remember the first one all that well, but they're fairly sure. And look, the first film has a lot of problems, but it is definitely better than this movie. This movie is just a shattered echo of that one. And yet, because it's building on nostalgia, people remember and say, oh yeah, I like this story better, because they're just getting it retold back to them, an echo of the feelings that they had already felt before. Their dreams of their childhood just nostalgically echoed forward, a decay into the present, and it's the only story that they can hear or tell. We see this over and over and over again in our culture, and it's especially prevalent today, where we see Hollywood constantly going back to the well of IP that they know to try to regurgitate stories from the past, maybe putting a new sheen on it, maybe putting it into another genre from another IP that they know, but ultimately just telling the same stories again and again and again and again, hoping that they can make the same amount of money that they made before. But every time they do this, we have less and less they were actually getting attached to in the minute, and that well of nostalgia eventually runs dry, and the next generation that is watching these stories now don't even know the entirety of the mythos of the franchise that they've been watching. And so don't even know when whatchamacallit Jar Jar Binks gets referenced in episode 8 or whatever, because they don't even know who the fuck Jar Jar is. And admittedly, I will hear you out there. A lot of you are saying, well, variations of the monomyth exist, but while they do exist, the dominant belief is that all stories are merely riffs on this theme. You can react against it or bend it or break it, but you have to know the rules before you can actually do something good.
I encountered the work of this man, Joseph Campbell, who had been a scholar, an American scholar of world mythology. And he compared all of the myths of the world and said, in effect, there's one story. It's the human story. And I responded to that. I'd been looking for that. I was on a quest to find the unwritten rules, and I knew there had to be some. So when I found Campbell's work in film school, it just opened the door. And it was like I had found maybe a knuckle bone and a tooth of this dinosaur, and he had the whole skeleton laid out. So it was just a huge gift that gave me all of those unwritten rules. And though he was talking about ancient myths, it also had very clear implications for modern storytelling.
And out of that mindset, nothing truly new can emerge if you're thinking of constantly reacting to what came before. Because as my favorite author Ursula K. Le Guin said, to oppose something is to uphold it. Aspiring creators are told they must master these rules before attempting originality, embedding this mindset into the very act of storytelling. With the rise of machine learning algorithms trained on decades of films, this trend has reached even new extremes, producing shallow, contextless imitations of past works, because machine learning doesn't know the context of what they're spewing their endless regurgitations into, something I talked about in this video. These algorithms, detached from the nuanced worlds they mimic, are justified by a culture that views context as irrelevant. After all, if stories are universal, if they've been going back all the way to the past, why can't we just sell them endlessly in the present? It's always just the same story, right? But at the same time as all of this, the 21st century saw an explosion of content alongside a cultural push for progressive values tied to identity politics. Calls for greater representation of women, people of color, and queer people and other marginalized voices created a paradox within these recycled narratives. The inclusion of diverse identities challenged the old guard of storytelling, but remained constrained by structures prioritizing profit and nostalgia over authenticity. Diverse characters and creators were welcomed into existing franchises, but only within the narrow confines of formulas built on the individualistic, conquest-driven arc of the monomyth. Instead of breaking free from these outdated templates, progressive elements were simply grafted onto them, resulting in stories that appeared inclusive, yet felt performative, failing to challenge the underlying systems themselves. The result was a landscape where diversity became both an asset and a liability. Women and people of color could wield lightsabers or lead Marvel superhero teams, but their stories were shaped by the same voices that long upheld hegemonic ideals. Studios, wary of alienating traditional quote-unquote audiences, often reduced these characters to symbols, tokens of progress without the depth of real representation. Consider Rey Skywalker in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. While positioned as the new lead of the franchise, Rey's character arc ultimately lacked meaningful depth or exploration of a unique perspective as a woman within the galaxy's deeply patriarchal systems. And I know all of you really wanted to see a storyline about a woman facing off against patriarchy within the Star Wars galaxy. I'm sure that would have been very interesting, you say, and I can hear your sarcasm. But let me tell you, we did get that story. It was a storyline for Mon Mothma in Star Wars Andor, and it actually kind of fucking ruled. Because that story actually presented Mon Mothma being someone in a privileged power position as a senator, but also a woman married to a husband who was getting her in trouble and also having to take care of a child and all the expectations that a woman has on her. And it made her storyline have to fit all of these different competing interests rather than just slotting her into, hey, woman in Star Wars now. And don't get me wrong, I love Rey. I had a lot of fun with those movies, but her character is very contextless. Put anyone into that role, whether it be a man, a woman, a black person, a white person, and the character pretty much can play the same because there's no context of what they are. And don't even get me into the actual black representation in those movies, John Boyega, who was started off as an interesting character, but was just sidelined when people started to throw backlash at a black character appearing in movies, and also Disney using the excuse that apparently black people didn't sell as well in China. Cowards, all of them. But the film framed Rey's power as inherent and unquestioned, sidestepping opportunities to explore her struggles, relationships, or any commentary in favor of nostalgic callbacks and fan service. And when these narratives faltered, anti-fandoms pounced, framing their failures as proof that diversity was the problem rather than critiquing the systems that flattened their potential. They were angry at seeing anyone else getting to take place in their story rather than the systems that were making these stories shallow in the first place. This backlash didn't emerge in isolation though. It was fueled by a sense of cultural displacement. For anti-fandoms, marginalized voices weren't just creative choices, but existential threats to a male-centric vision of heroism. A female superhero or a black Jedi wasn't merely new, it was framed as an intrusion, a deliberate challenge to a nostalgic past where men dominated both the screen and the story. To these groups, these characters became antagonists, not within the narratives, but to the narrative itself, embodying a perceived attack on tradition. By challenging white cis men's position as makers of meaning within film, they challenged white cis men's identity because it challenged the very basis for the story that they have constantly told themselves that they could be. That they were owed the woman, owed the trophy, owed the position in society if as long as they work hard and became the hero who returned with the elixir. A position that many of them, especially if they were lower class, were never going to get, but felt like they could. The Last Jedi in particular became a cultural flashpoint, sparking reactionary outrage over Luke Skywalker's portrayal. For some, his disillusioned masculinity in the film felt like a betrayal, not just of the character, but of masculine ideals that he had symbolized in the original trilogy. This backlash evolved into a rallying cry for outrage merchants who weaponized the film as a symbol of cultural decline, turning it into proof of an existential war, a masculine identity. And this is where figures like Critical Drinker and Nerdrotic have exploited the narrative, building up their audiences and their brands, reframing inclusivity as an existential threat to cultural and personal identity. Their rhetoric feeds on nostalgia for a male-driven past, portraying marginalized characters in progressive storytelling as hostile disruptions to the status quo. Luke's arc in The Last Jedi rejects traditional heroism, exposing the limitations of the monomyth.
Time it is for you to look past a pile of old books.
It's why, for all that movie's faults, and it does have faults, I think Luke's storyline was actually the best part. Confronted with the galaxy's cyclical nostalgic decay with the defeat of the Empire, giving rise to the Empire 2 Electric Boogaloo, the First Order, Luke's retreat into self-doubt reflects not weakness, but an honest reckoning with systemic failure. The movie does end up featuring him rising up and recognizing that he has to pass the torch to someone else, in this case a woman, and the movie overall has a theme, if somewhat ham-fistedly, of the need to fight for what we save, not against what we hate.
That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love.
But for fans clinging to fantasies of male power, this felt intolerable. They longed for the infallible Jedi warrior of the expanded universe novels that they read as a kid, where Luke could pull down entire planets and go pew pew pew, and I got a big lightsaber, and I can hit things, and I can do cool stuff. A man who could change the entire course of galactic politics with his own choices. But The Last Jedi and reality alike reject such simplicity. Luke's vulnerability and introspection challenge both Hollywood's nostalgic recycling of hero narratives and societal expectations of men as always being strong and dominant and the one in control of the narrative. But his humanity is framed as a weakness by those who watch the film who view change as a threat, making his portrayal radical and threatening to them. And this dissonance-fueled reactionary anger set the stage for figures like Donald Trump to resonate as anti-hero archetypes within our real world. To his particularly white male supporters, but white people generally, and anyone who has bought into the bootstrap American dream, Trump embodied defiance. A flawed, aggressive force who could reclaim their perceived loss of power. The monomythical hero who can retake and reset the culture, reset the monomyth, reset society. He's the Anakin Skywalker. Much like The Last Jedi's critics wanted a return to male-centered power fantasies, Trump's bombastic bravado and rejection of introspection in any way offered a promise to make America great again, forcing the world back into a narrative where they held the center. His appeal mirrored the backlash to The Last Jedi. Both stem from resistance to vulnerability, change, and the questioning of entrenched power structures. Asking us not to constantly fight against something, but fight for something. And again, the way The Last Jedi did it was very ham-fisted, but it is a good point.
Saving what we love.
But as things started to continue, more and more diverse creators started to get a place within Hollywood. And many of these stories, however, struggled to find their footing because studios eager to profit from inclusivity, quote unquote, rarely ceded creative control to those with lived experiences, resulting in narratives that felt hollow and incomplete. This wasn't a failure of representation, but an industry unwilling to reimagine storytelling. On top of this, it was creators who had grown up learning the rules, trying to take back their own style of storytelling to learn what it would mean. And as a result, their stories weren't told perfectly because they were still figuring it out. But I would rather a much messier film trying to figure out some sort of message that feels truthful than a regurgitation of the same thing just with another identity in the lead role. And anti-fandoms weaponize these missteps, framing them as, again, proof that diversity weakens quality, ignoring the constraints of a profit-driven system. Marginalized creators and characters face the impossible task of succeeding within a system resistant to their full inclusion, as their narratives often clash with the dominant monomyth framework, while also having to face back against the anti-fandoms amplifying their flaws, fueling cultural backlash. Meanwhile, audiences yearning for representation end up having to defend even mediocre effort, fearing erasure if they don't. This creates a zero-sum conversation trapped between conquest and nostalgia, leaving little space to imagine truly transformative storytelling. I want messy, dirty, fucked up trans people and things, but the way storytelling goes, we constantly have to have characters that represent all of trans people, that have to be the perfect version of it. And while I try to critique it and offer different ways that it could be better, I end up also having to defend it from the people going woke every single time they see a trans person just simply, you know, look at you. Another really good example of this recently is the show Star Wars: The Acolyte. The show was written by a queer woman and featured black and queer protagonists and examined systemic oppression through a Star Wars lens. A standout element for me of many of the show was its portrayal of a black queer-led collective of Force witches, ones that were labeled as dark side users by the Jedi, despite them instead being collectivist and non-violent.
Persecuted, forced into hiding, all because some would consider our power dark, unnatural.
In contrast, the Sith are all about domination and power, something that these collectivist Force witches are not, and yet the Jedi view both of them as dark side and dangerous. This culminates in the witches' genocide under the guise of policing the Force by the Jedi. It serves as a clear allegory for how institutions, especially the neoliberal ones that we have today, in which Star Wars and the Republic generally represent, often vilify and harm marginalized groups, while at the same time seeming to fight fascism, but also allowing it to thrive. My favorite episodes are the series' 2 flashback ones. The 2 episodes show us the same event from 2 different perspectives, from that of the Force witches, and then later on from the perspective of the Jedi. And in the Jedi episode, Jedi Master Soul ostensibly has a noble concern for the safety of the kids in this queer collective, but it's warped by the biases that frame the queer dark side group as inherently dangerous, especially to children.
I feel she's meant to be my Padawan.
Her coven will never let her leave. They are so insular, so strange.
They mocked her sister with dark magic.
Ceremonial markings are customary in many cultures in the galaxy.
And that they have the right to come in and take anyone that is like them and bring them into the Jedi Order. It echoes the way systems of power, like policing, justify violence through narratives of protection and order. Soul cannot see the collective on its own terms. Instead, his biases constantly construct them as a threat, leading him to interpret acts of care and self-defense, like the black woman leader moving to protect her child, not as courageous or loving, but as dangerous and worthy of a reaction of violence. He has been framed to see everything that he views as dark side as a threat, and thus instantaneously reacts with violence, just like a cop who will instantly pull his gun because he's been taught to view anyone that is black or anyone that he has come up against as a potential threat, one that could lead to his death. It parallels how police operate in the real world, where narratives of public safety often mask deep-seated biases. The language of protection is wielded to justify harm against marginalized communities, particularly black, queer, and trans people. And by the way, I'm just giving a very, very brief summary of the depth of this show. I highly recommend Laron Reedus' excellent video on the series. It's gonna go into way more depth. All this said though, while The Acolyte did have compelling ideas and brought up perspectives from a marginalized perspective and put them into a Star Wars lens in a really cool way, and I personally liked the show a lot. I mean, how could I not when they hit me with literal anti-lightsaber metal and one of the coolest fight sequences ever? I mean, like, hello, can you not see the guy literally turn off a lightsaber by headbutting it? What the fuck? It's so cool. Anyways, the show wasn't without its glaring flaws. It has tons of structural issues, awkward dialogue, and even uneven execution, leading to a show with strong themes but imperfect delivery. Much, by the way, like the Star Wars prequels that we all like to say are perfect now in our nostalgic memory.
It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Again, someone who likes the prequels. I have a Jar Jar toy. It's sitting right there. It's been here the whole video. How can you not say I don't like the prequels? But they do have problems, and yet we tend to say George Lucas was the great man visionary, and I bet you Star Wars: The Acolyte, while outside of some groups who absolutely adore it, will go down in history as a flawed failure at best. But The Acolyte does have issues. Like, there are literally just tons of structural problems. I mean, explain to me why the 2 flashback episodes are framed as being from a specific perspective, but don't fully anchor themselves in that perspective in each episode. Instead, coming across as objective despite their clear manipulative framing to show us a specific group's point of view, diluting its effects and how we perceive it in relation to the characters of the modern day. And I would bet you, by the way, that a lot of the show's issues, not all of them, but a lot of them would come back to having been to make a black and queer themed show within the Disney system that is shown to be actively hostile to these perspectives beyond having them visually there, if even then. I mean, look at the fact that Disney stopped funding the movie Nimona, pushing it out of being created by its studio, having to go to another studio because it was made and had trans and queer themes in it. Or the fact that they thought Inside Out 2 was becoming too gay and shoved those down as well. Or the one that angers me the most, a show Dinosaur Girl having its one episode about trans kids in sports that was a beautiful discussion of that topic and was centered around the fact that kids, whether they be trans or not, just want to play and sit and have to learn how to break down and destroy entire systems made to stop them from just having fun because the parents are just kind of idiots around whenever a queer person shows up. And didn't air it, and we would have never been able to see it if it hadn't leaked online. Because Disney are cowards who are too afraid to have actual queer representation with queer themes in its work. Even if they are willing to allow us to be tokens every once in a while. Tokens, by the way, that are probably going to get less and less as outrage over our mere representation gets more and more backlash by the anti-woke mob. And the same thing happened to Star Wars The Acolyte, by the way. On YouTube, discussions labeled it as the worst Star Wars ever, often obsessing over nostalgic trivialities like the fact that Ka-Adi-Mundi appears in an episode set 100 years before the prequel trilogy when his age on a trading card sold in the early 2000s said that he couldn't possibly be that old. To which most of you, hearing all of that, I'm sure respond with, who the fuck is Ka-Adi-Mundi?
So a young Ki-Adi-Mundi stepped in, a young... so young, we had to make his birth date 40 years earlier because he was that young. We had to literally change what was already established. And people are saying, oh, but it wasn't established. It was. He had a birth date. Many different sources, and one of them including is a Topps card. This was all done when George was in charge. He's 70 years old, dude.
But this grievance-driven narrative that was amplified by algorithms that love to utilize anger dismissed the show's merit and reframed its centering on marginalized voices as an attack on fandom, which is seen as an inherent attack on manhood, as we've talked about, and conflating representation with an assault on male-centric nostalgia. Meaning the discourse had to simply come down around the fact of, do you like the show or do you hate the show? Are you woke or anti-woke? Instead of any of the nuance of the way the story was told or its themes in any way, shape, or form. Instead reducing it to a binary of, this is the black show, are you gonna defend it or not?
And this is where the blame game begins, because when a show as big and progressive as The Acolyte crashes and burns, a convenient scapegoat must be found. Pretty soon you'll be seeing all kinds of weapons-grade cope from the legacy news media that Star Wars fans were just too dumb and bigoted to understand the sheer majesty of The Acolyte.
It's just a constant reducing of these themes into that same storyline that I was telling you before, just in our real world now. Instead of talking about the nuances of each of these shows and ideas and stories and themes perspectives, their unique voices within them. But studios are beginning to take notice, especially after the recent 2024 election. They've started forming fan councils to avoid vocal toxic backlash. However, such councils are unlikely to advocate for bold inclusivity or risky narratives, as fans often push for the comfort of familiarity rather than the innovation needed to move storytelling forward. As some of my favorite creators who have made some of my favorite franchise films in things like Star Trek have said, you don't want to give fans what they want, you want to figure out what you want to tell and make other people want it too. Why aren't you asking, what is the cool thing that I need to make, whether you have to put it in a franchise or not? And just figure out the best way to tell that story within the framework you're given, whether it be a franchise movie, a TV show, or if it's just a book you want to write, or a TV show with no IP attached to it. But instead we constantly go with what story are we going to be forced to tell, and who can we tokenize and put within it. A tokenization that's going to get less and less as Hollywood continues to listen to more and more toxic outrage as the culture shifts back towards more and more overt fascism. Thank you. Yay. Meanwhile, at the same time, Hollywood faces its own ongoing economic crisis, with regurgitated nostalgic stories failing to deliver the returns the studio expected. And that is happening alongside a collective push for change, epitomized by the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes and the recent negotiations around the animation industry as Hollywood, as creators demand the wealth hoarded by executives who have centralized profits and in doing so stifled creativity, as well as the ability to tell their stories the way they want to, instead of being forced to utilize tools that will just cause regurgitation of the work built up on theft. But instead of addressing these systemic failures, studios often again scapegoat representation, pointing to aggrieved fan backlash as the cause of their struggles rather than acknowledging their own unwillingness to foster genuine artistic risk and innovation in uplifting new voices, instead relying on nostalgic narratives that worked before to try to recapture the mass universal audience. But as anger and grievance gain institutional power, people are increasingly rejecting monomythical narratives centered on great men, or they're doubling down on it, recognizing how these stories often uphold white patriarchal dominance. With cultural politics increasingly polarized between those clinging to the status quo and those seeking egalitarian inclusive stories, as well as politics, Hollywood's inability to reckon with the shift exposes a deeper crisis: the failure to imagine a storytelling future beyond the myths of the past. And it's something we desperately need to figure out. This ties deeply into the narrative structure that men are conditioned to see as not just good storytelling, but as the only story worth telling. It's a storytelling model steeped in colonial ideas of gender and race, perpetuated by white supremacy and patriarchy and colonialization. Outraged merchants like The Critical Drinker and Nerdrotic weaponize this narrative in a fandom space just as Matt Walsh does in a political space or Andrew Tate does in a masculine self-help style space, shaping it into a vision of manhood that centers cis, white, straight men as the arbiters of what is good and truthful, and all else is lies and a decay of manhood in Western civilization. Their mythical version of Rome falling beneath them, they need to be the good Lucius saving the day and resetting it back up. Don't look ahead at the actual history around us happening. No, blame the marginalized people, it's their fault. And these merchants' success and anger-driven algorithms is no accident. It's the result of preying on insecurities born of societal conditioning, amplified by systems that like to sell back what people want to already hear, instead of people that are like me saying, hey, maybe challenge yourself to hear something new. These men are not creators, they don't create anything, they are manipulators thriving on cycles of pain and ostracization. Andrew Tate, for example, markets his rhetoric as liberation from the Matrix, but his vision of freedom is anything but. He doesn't even understand what the Matrix is about, a look inside to liberate yourself from the systems of control. Instead, he sells himself as a Neo, glorifying control as a masculine ideal, reducing relationships to transactions where women are trophies and men compete for validation, perpetuating toxic hierarchies. Similarly, Critical Drinker frames his critiques as apolitical defenses of authenticity, decrying woke politics while aligning with conservative platforms like the Daily Wire. His performative masculinity, built on anger and resistance to change, reinforces a cycle of dominance and isolation disguised as empowerment. These grifts profit by offering the illusion of strength while ensuring that systems that generate men's pain remain intact. This cult of manhood doesn't just harm others, the scapegoats that they target their rage at, it consumes the men who submit to it. Stripped of their humanity by systems that commodified their worth, men are driven to violence, scapegoating others while being hollowed out themselves. Neoliberal capitalism, with its emphasis on competition and individualism, demand that they suppress vulnerability, equating dominance with value so it can endlessly and lazily sell the same package easily to a stagnant culture. And this dehumanization, this seeing everything as transactional, as one thing having to come at the expense of the other, so why not be the thing that does the having the expense come at, paves the way for fascism, which exploits their pain, offering the illusion of power in exchange for complicity and oppression. To sustain this cycle, men are coerced into killing their capacity for care, empathy, and love, and killing others, propping up a hollow facade of strength at cost of their inner selves, a destruction that leads to violence against others and themselves. And these groups that sell this narrative to men, whether political movements or cultural creators, are incapable of truly imagining anything earnest on any level. I've already said that creators like Nerdrotic and The Critical Drinker, who have overly focused on this video, but they're not the only ones, have not been able to create anything truly new. It's a fundamental failing that reveals itself most clearly in how they view others' art and their own art. Look at people like Star Wars Theory just regurgitating Star Wars tales from expanded universe novels with AI. But more importantly, look at the Daily Wire, a company that has invested heavily in pushing its ideological narratives through media, with works like Matt Walsh's What is a Woman or their anti-trans sports comedy Lady Ballers. Much of the critique from leftists like myself of these films and others like them has rightfully focused on their hateful message or poor storytelling. But what strikes me most is how deeply cynical these works are, how utterly incapable they are of genuine emotional introspection or sincerity. And yet they do well because they are just selling what their audience already wants, to point and laugh at the marginalized person. These films are easy junk food, not asking people to introspect or think deeply about anything, but instead just something to consume. And figures like Ben Shapiro and others in these circles are, at their core, bitter failures. Hollywood rejects who couldn't cut it as actual filmmakers. They clawed at the edges of the creative world, desperate to be understood, to create art that resonated, but they failed because earnest emotion terrifies them. Vulnerability would mean confronting the fragility of their worldview, exposing the cracks in their rigid ideologies that they cling to with desperation, to make themselves feel whole. Rather than face that fear, they lash out, building careers on mockery and destruction. As Hollywood itself becomes increasingly hollow, these grifters begin to thrive, peddling empty performances that overcompensate for their lack of authenticity. They try to prove their worth by tearing others down, reinforcing a worldview that thrives on cruelty and cynicism. Their fear of emotional truth drives them to reject anything real, leaving their creations lifeless and their messages steeped in venom. They aren't creators, they're cowards, weaponizing their failure to cling to a world that rewards cruelty over connection. Take the movie Lady Ballers, for example. I have been particularly fascinated by this film, but not for the reasons that most in my sphere are. The film's premise, a group of men pretending to be women to dominate basketball, advances a transphobic and also racist narrative devoid of character development or meaningful engagement. And many of my trans compatriots have rightfully pointed out that fact. But that's not actually what interests me about the film, because that was expected. I knew that that's what I was getting when I even saw the announcement of it. What interests me more is the fact that amid the farce, there is one unexpected subplot. One of the men who joins the basketball team begins, through playing out the role of a woman, to realize that she's transgender. Throughout the entire film, her journey unfolds through scenes of growing self-acceptance. By coming to realize by playing the role of a woman, by being seen even nominally as a woman by those around her, it makes her feel more like her. This eventually culminates in a scene near the end of the film where she comes out to the main character, played by Daily Wire owner Jeremy Boring.
All those years playing basketball, I never really felt like myself. A decade in Hollywood trying to figure out who I really was, and then I started working at the dollhouse, and this is the real me, coach. This is who I am. Proud of myself for the first time.
For a fleeting moment, the film stumbles accidentally into something genuine, a story of self-discovery and truth, of finding your own heart. But the filmmakers, because they are who they are, reject this glimmer of humanity with astonishing cruelty. Instead of exploring her arc, they resolve it with a punchline. Boring kicks her in the fucking balls. No introspection, no growth, just a lame biological essentialist gag that mocks her identity and reduces vulnerability to humiliation enacted through violence. The message is clear. Self-acceptance is a joke that we all, in the audience, should laugh at. And anyone challenging the status quo deserves ridicule and violence to get them back in line. Laugh at the marginalized person. Tell them to go back into the closet. Tell them to never be themselves. Just get in line and do the thing that we fucking want you to do. This moment encapsulates the cynicism of these narratives and moreover their worldview. Even when they stumble into emotional resonance, their response is to crush it with cruelty. It's not just bad storytelling, it's a refusal to engage with the truths of the human heart that could threaten their rigid, dehumanizing worldview. Earnestness terrifies them because to be open to it is to risk understanding, and understanding would expose the fragility of their ideology and their stupid, cruel hearts. Fascism and control thrive on this rejection of humanity, but it's also their greatest weakness. Earnestness, care, and connection are what they cannot confront. Lady Ballers represents the only kind of art these creators are capable of making. Art of cruelty. It reflects their ideology perfectly, hollow, hostile, and devoid of the vulnerability that gives stories meaning. This is the art that they will keep making, locked in a cycle of hollowness or mockery and pain, because it is all they know. But by telling stories centered on growth and compassion, we defy their oppressive narratives and remind people of their shared humanity. The question is, what kind of stories are those? The monomyth, for all of its cultural ubiquity, is more than just a storytelling tool. It's a reinforcement mechanism. It's why grifters on the right can so easily co-opt the language of heroism, struggle, and triumph. These familiar beats, recycled endlessly, create a default narrative structure that implicitly upholds certain power dynamics. It's not just that they tell stories, they tell these stories again and again, reinforcing a world where dominance and individual conquest are seen as the highest virtues. The monomyth thrives because it feels natural, like the air we breathe, like the only way we can or should unfold a story, because it's the only story we have been taught for so long. But the resistance to questioning these narratives doesn't just come from the far right, it also exists, often quietly, within progressive spaces as well. When I or others critique these structures, I'm often met with responses like, why not just inject diversity into these frameworks? Cast women, queer people, or people of color as the hero, and our work is done. It's well-intentioned as a suggestion, but it misses the point entirely. Simply changing the face of the hero with 1,000 faces while leaving the structure intact doesn't challenge the underlying assumptions of what heroism is or who gets to define it. The result is often a perpetuation of the same stories of domination, individualism, and conquest, but with a new, more inclusive cast. But even when we critique these stories, we often fall into its trap. In his fantastic video, Edgelord Movies Broke Me, FD Signifier unpacks how narratives like Breaking Bad, Fight Club, or Joker shaped cultural touchstones for young men, not by dismantling toxic masculinity, but by reinforcing it. These stories critique systems of power and the manhood used to uphold it, yet their framing ensures that the same destructive visions of masculinity remain front and centered. Even ostensibly subversive narratives like The Boys or Attack on Titan, which try to point out how terrible these heroes are, still fall into the same trap. As FD explains, they critique the anti-hero while leaving his dominance unchallenged as the center of the story. The story may condemn his actions, but it glorifies his aesthetic, ensuring that the myths of agreed masculinity remain intact. Sure, power harmed them, but they got power in the end, and isn't that what we're supposed to want, even if it makes us feel sad? At least that's what the men who are built up on these stories are told. And us tearing them down or deconstructing them or attacking them or trying to say, hey, look, this thing is bad, just makes these people who see these narratives feel that they themselves are being vilified and that they become the anti-hero.
If they didn't say anything derogatory towards the paying customer and the fan, people would have complained, but it would have been over. That was their biggest mistake, and they continue it to this very day, and they use it as part of their marketing.
And hey, look, there's a wonderful authoritarian bad guy anti-hero who everyone else hates. Why not vote for him? Because I see myself in him. And he'll attack the minorities that are telling me that my story is bad. And I want us to rethink how we talk about these types of stories, because not only does it affect men, but how we think about ourselves generally. And I don't want to toss men aside or say men bad or men awful. I am attacking people like Nerdrotic or Critical Drinker or The Daily Wire because those assholes deserve it, but the people who buy into their narratives are also people that we need to listen to, but they need to choose to listen first. And that is something that I want to talk about in the near future. Because this resistance to rethinking narrative structures isn't just theoretical. It seeps into how all of us interact with each other, even within our own spaces. Progressive spaces, for all their ideals, are often combative in ways that mirror the antagonistic binaries of the very narratives we claim to critique. If our cultural frameworks center on conflict, dominance, and individual triumph, then even our attempts to deconstruct or correct these frameworks tend to recreate those dynamics. And we fall into the trap of defining ourselves in opposition, of fighting their myths rather than building our own, and tearing down each other if we're not all falling in line with the same narrative that we all need to have, instead of having solidarity and realizing that there is a diversity of different tactics, beliefs, and ideas, and that's what makes us stronger. But we don't see that because we have to sell ourselves within these same frameworks. Hell, I'm here on YouTube making a video about these things with these creators on the front to frame themselves in an antagonistic binary because I know you out there are going to be more likely to click a video with these assholes' faces on it rather than me saying, hey, here are some ways we can think about different stories. But that's what I want you to challenge yourself to do, because I am not going to end here. I have another video where I am going to, in the near future, present those narratives to you. But I am betting you that video is not going to be doing as well, but I want you to please look for it. We need to shift our energy towards stories that are expansive, that don't position themselves as responses to grievance, but as celebrations of transformation and possibility. This is the challenge I am going to take up in my next essay. I want to step outside of the inherited frameworks and explore what it might mean to tell stories that grow from our own experiences, values, and hopes. Stories that reflect a vision of the world as it could be, not merely as it is. Stories are not the main drivers of politics, but they shape the scaffolding of our imaginations. And imagination is what we need most right now. Not just to critique the myths we've inherited, but to build new myths that can guide us towards a better, more expansive future. So please, I desperately plead with you, join me in the next video as we begin to chart that path forward. Let's move beyond the cycles of despair and antagonism and into a storytelling space that dares to dream, to challenge, and to create something profoundly, beautifully new. Hey there, interwebs. Stick around for a quick second because I'm going to have a couple teases for you in the next few seconds. But just to quick say it up front, thank you so much for watching this video. And if you liked this one, as I hinted at just a second ago, there will be another video coming in just a few weeks that is a companion piece to this video that is going to be about stories that resist, stories that help us break out of the cycles of control and domination and help us try to imagine something new. Stories that I think we desperately need right now to reframe what it means to be human and how we think about ourselves and the futures that we can build. Because while I don't believe stories are going to cause the change themselves, they do help us reframe and rethink about how we can build a better future. And I think that that is the core of how you start change. And I really do think that video is going to be probably more even important than this one. But frankly, considering that I'm not going to be able to put Ben Shapiro or Matt Walsh or whoever the hell I ended up putting in the thumbnail for this video on that one, I don't think it's going to do as well, because our culture rewards videos and things that are set up in a culture war or against each other or things like that. So a takedown on Matt Walsh does better than, hey, these are stories that I find really beautiful and transformative. That being said, if you do want the video early, I am releasing it early over on my Patreon. In fact, if I've timed this out well, the video should release over on my Patreon in just a few days after this goes live on YouTube, as well as a companion video to that one that is only going to be available on my Patreon. So support me over there to get the video early, extra videos, and your name in videos and other stuff like that. And it also helps support me doing what I'm doing, because finances are a little bit rougher, and people have been amazing about supporting, but any more support really does help me and my fiance out. Especially because, and here is where the tease comes in that I hinted at, or teased earlier, I wish I could announce it officially yet. I'm not allowed to legally. However, this year I am working on a couple of really big projects, like dream projects that I've wanted to do my entire life that are going to be outside of YouTube. I can't wait to officially announce them. I was hoping I could, but I can't just yet. But as a result of that, it does mean that after my next video, I will still have videos coming out on this channel over the year, but they will be a little bit longer in getting out because I'm going to have to make sure I'm not burning myself out working on these projects. I already am burning myself out a little bit, so I'm trying to be careful about it. And Patreon is how I'm able to pay my bills, feed myself, feed my fiance, feed my cats, and all of that stuff, especially during that time where YouTube is unreliable, both because YouTube is just generally unreliable in terms of that, and also I'd be balancing a lot of other work. I promise you it's going to be really cool, really amazing, dream projects for me, and I hope will be really cool for all of you, and I will hopefully be able to announce them very, very soon. And don't forget to check out the crowdfunding campaign link for the short film Long Way that I mentioned earlier in the video. If any of that sounds exciting to you, please consider supporting me over on Patreon. Regardless, though, of if you do that at all, please be on the lookout for that video that's coming out next, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I am also on Nebula, which is the platform that supports a lot of some really cool projects that I am going to be doing, including my movie IDENTITEAZE, the sci-fi film that I released that stars Abigail Thorne of Philosophy Tube and Star Wars The Acolyte and many other things, as well as John Delancey of Star Trek The Next Generation fame and many other amazing folks. So check that out over on Nebula. You get my videos early. You support me directly if you sign up for Nebula, as well as many other amazing YouTubers and creators that are over there making cool work and may have something to do with some of the projects that I'm going to be working on this year. So be on the lookout for all of that. But beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons who help me do what I do. I adore you, and I could not do this without you. But an extra special thank you to Mock at 80, Carrie Ellen Foss, Veronica Fox, Blue, Mary Mello, Barbie Ann Rounds, Sarah Montgomery, Iron, Stephen Clenard, Christian Hurst, Jazz Miss, Jade Stark, Daniel Prone, Randy Thompson, Alex Miller, Lily Blanley, Samuel Howard, Dark Archon, Auntie Kate 808, Vincent Ellington, Tara Rose, Amada Kaiba, Miranda Ketia, Atheistic Snail, Zane Schuschler, Michael Wonet, Super Desi, Meadow Whisperer, Joseph Dewey the Gnome, Sammy Joe Retro, Daihachi, Chris Showers, Lily Gray, Angela Hendricks, Rose Conley, David Demma, Katie Starr, Todd Verling, Cade Kitten, Shep Alderson, Dominic Noble, Cleo McKeever, Anthony Evans, James Krivda, Brian Walters, Villager 138, Farengato, Kalarina Bonbon, W. Randy Ed, Patrick Green, Kevin Frogtag, Gumunder Stephenson, Sean Silver, Daryl William Sandifer, Flyan Conda, Epsilon is greater than, Ryan Hunter, Jamie, Casey Kyle Hampton, Troy Stull, Al Tantivy, Teague Wilson, John Witherby, Alexa Burris, Erica Barrica, Care On, Casual Observer, Sarah Lemerow, Patrick Crompton, Crit Mullen, Jason Knott, Stephen Richardson, Hope Jason Tuliana, Sade Zerd, Zach Prax, Ing Marie, it's Craig Lowe, Penile Sparing Vaginoplasty, Grumpy Dragon 75, Stephen Chapman, Vale Hunkanen, Damian Rice, Sasha M, Pramita Bagchi, Rosalind Bennett, Melinda Walters, Melody Ann Winters Good, White Lion, Sean Piper, Juliana Rigel, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Sarah Bystam, Carrie the Neuroturtle, Tyler Edwards, Sophie's Dead Name Walking, Jordy Lucero, Richard Guderizzi, Meat Popsicle, Craig and David, Luna, Laura Demeros, Celestial Dawn, Kezzy Garrett Smithinson, Alec Leigh Berry, Bruno, Tori Perez, Crit Fax, Lev Goodman, Nyan Fan, Jocelyn Ethersford, Quite Bearish, Michael Weber, Mira G, Maximilian Marks, Henry Pierce, Tom Chi 311, and Julie Werner. Adore y'all. Thank you. Mwah.